so in this video, I'm going to go over photography basics. So for anybody that just got a camera, or maybe they're trying to use their smartphone, this is going to be a quick overview. Now, the first thing you need to know about photography is the capturing of light, and the capturing of that light is going to produce an image, right? Doesn't matter what kind of camera you have, whether you're going to be using your smartphone, a DSLR, or a mirrorless camera, or even a film camera, most of the principles operate the same way. Now, if you're using your smartphone, maybe some of these options might not be available to you. You might have to download external apps, but I'm going to give you the basic settings that all photographers have to learn. So there are three basic settings that photographers use. That is going to be aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Those three things combine to create what we call the exposure triangle. Now, all the exposure triangle is that those three settings control how much light is going to be in your image. So you have to basically, as a photographer, balance those three things. Now, I'm going to start off with the first one, which is ISO. Now, it's not necessarily the first one, but it's the first one I'll explain. What ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So pretty much when you turn up your ISO, light in the given area is going to be appearing more brighter in your image. So ISO is something you use to control how much sensitive your camera is going to be to light. Now, typically speaking, the higher you go with your ISO, the more noise introduced into your image. What we call noise is basically if you're zooming on a photo, you're going to be seeing like some little, it's like it's not a part of the photo, it's like some little dust particles. Typically, those aren't what we'd like to see in our images, so we try to keep our ISO low. You adjust the ISO along with your other settings, but ISO is something that we typically try to keep low if we can. And next setting in the exposure triangle that we play around with is aperture. Aperture basically controls what's in focus on your camera. It's measured in what we call f-stops, right? So for instance, right now, I think my camera is at an aperture of f2.0. That is what we call a fast aperture or a low aperture number. What that does is that it's going to have not as much things in focus. Reason being is because the aperture is so low. Basically, if I was to put my hand, let's say this was a picture. As you can see, everything behind me is blurred out. That's because the aperture is low. Now, if I'm to change the aperture and go to a higher aperture, let's say, now you notice as I change the aperture, the image gets darker. So I'm changing the aperture. 1 second, let me just adjust by turning up the ISO. So as you can see, changing one settings affect the other, but I'm changing my aperture to something higher. 1 second, this will all make sense pretty soon. So when I change my aperture, more things are in focus, right? You can see what's behind me. So when I go back down to that low aperture and everything gets brighter, as you can see. 1 second. This is a very makeshift way to show you guys, but I'm shooting myself, unfortunately. Don't have an assistant right now. So turning that down and then turning down my aperture. So as you can see, you can't see what's behind me. So that's how aperture basically affects images. When you're using a low aperture, it basically blurs out the background. So there's different creative ways to use something like that. For instance, if you want to have a picture where you have something that's blurry in the background, then you're going to use a lower aperture because that's going to basically, kind of dissolve your background and give it a more dreamy look. It's what we call basically bokeh. And then if you have maybe a landscape where you want to get lots of things in focus, you're going to use a higher aperture so that way you can get more stuff in focus. So as you can see, changing your aperture affects the focus, and it also affects the amount of light going into your camera. So you have to adjust these settings as you basically play around with one. You have to use the other to balance them back out. And the third setting now is our shutter speed. So what shutter speed is how fast and slow the camera closes. So think of it from this perspective. If you have a subject that is not moving, you don't necessarily have to use a fast shutter speed. Shutter is measured in fractions of a second. So I'd say average shutter for like any subject, even if it's not moving, would be, I wouldn't go any lower than 1/50th of a second, because anything lower than that, I think it's going to be easy for you to shake the camera. Because basically, the longer your shutter takes to close, it's the easier for it to basically feel motion. So when you use very slow shutters, like shutters that are even like more than a second, you actually introduce a lot of micro jitters and motions. So what I do is whatever lens I'm using, I try to double the lens on my shutter speed or even triple it so that way I don't introduce any camera motion, even for non-moving subjects. So right now I have a 50mm lens, which that is just basically the distance the lens is, and I would use a shutter speed of 1/100. So that way when I'm taking pictures, it doesn't shake or I don't get blurry photos. So your shutter speed, you use faster shutter speeds if you're capturing subjects that are going to be like moving. So let's say you're doing sports photography, you know, people are moving fast. You're going to want to go up into those very high fractions of a second, maybe 1/1000, 1/2000. That way when they're doing whatever they're doing, you're freezing them in motion. So fast shutter is to capture movement. Slower shutter introduces like, let's say you were doing long exposure photography, which is something I don't really do much, but it's because you're keeping your shutter open for so long, it's almost as if it feels like things are being slowly dragged across it's almost like things feel like they're still moving because it's taking so long for the lens to close. So the faster your lens closes, it's almost like you're freezing things in motion, and the slower your lens takes to close, then it's like you're introducing motion. So pretty much you play around with those 3 settings to get your desired photo. Whether you want to freeze motion, whether it is maybe you just want it to be looking normal, whether it is you want it to have a blurry background, whether it is you even want to introduce some grain into your photo, you're going to play around with those 3 settings. Now, those settings are only available to you if you're shooting manual. Now, if you're getting into photography, I highly advise just starting on manual. Reason being, I think it's very important to get the practice on those manual modes. You actually don't have to. Most cameras nowadays have automatic modes where you basically can just play with one setting. So for instance, if you're really just getting started and you don't want to just dive in head first, you can use different modes that prioritize different settings. So you have aperture priority, where that will allow you to set your aperture and your camera will adjust your exposure for all the other settings. You have shutter priority, which does the same thing. And you have automatic modes where the camera will pick the best settings for you based on what it thinks is good. But personally, I just feel like it's not a big deal to just jump into manual mode, especially if you're not doing like professional work. It's perfectly fine to experiment and see which one works, because the quicker you start playing around like that, you'll get the hang of it. Because when the camera chooses certain points and certain things for you, you don't get to actually see how one thing affects the other. So for me personally, I'll tell you to just jump straight into manual mode and get started. For most smartphones, iPhones, you do have the option to control aperture right now, I believe. I'm not sure. Well, actually, I do think you can control both aperture and shutter on your iPhone. I do think iPhones have manual modes. If not, there are camera apps that you can download that will allow you to change those settings on your phone. Now that we've spoken briefly on the exposure triangle, the next thing I want for you guys to understand is shooting, what format you're going to shoot in. So you have 2 main formats. You have RAW and JPEG. Think of JPEG as it's called a compressed format, and what that basically means is the image is already baked in. Basically, it's compressed in a way that it doesn't take up a lot of space, so it's ready and good to go to be published and posted. So the thing with JPEG is, if you are not planning on editing your photos, then you want to shoot in JPEG, because that way it's like easier to transfer to a smartphone. It can probably go straight to social media. But if you want to go in and edit your photos and play around with stuff and manipulate stuff, then you want to shoot in what we call RAW. Now, a big mistake we make as beginner photographers is that we forget to switch to RAW, especially when we're doing like big photo shoots, because JPEG photos, while they can be edited, they don't have as much depth because they're a compressed format. So basically, imagine an image has all kinds of data and information in it, but because they want to make it smaller, they just cram it together and now it's already ready and good to go. But with RAW, it's so stretched out that it has to be edited first. So JPEG doesn't have the same latitude as RAW. So if you want to edit your photos, you need to shoot RAW. There's times when you don't have to. Maybe you're doing like some casual stuff. Maybe you just want to post a quick photo. Then you can shoot JPEG. But always remember to switch between the two. Next thing we'll touch on is composition. I personally suggest that you just learn about these rules, but remember that these rules can be broken. Composition is just basically how you frame things in your image. You're gonna have, stuff like the rule of thirds. You're gonna have stuff like leading lines. You're gonna have stuff like the golden ratio. my basic principle on that is that pretty much you just need to learn the rules, try them out, see which styles you like, and feel free to break them. Once you understand why they make sense and why they work, then you can go ahead and break them. Composition is just something that you have to experiment with. You might like different things. You might like something that breaks all the rules, but the rules are just something for you to have a basic guideline towards. So for a beginner, I'd say just learn the rule of thirds, and that'll do very well for you. But you're gonna find that maybe you don't always like using that as your primary thing. Maybe you like using leading lines more, maybe you like symmetry on the frame. It's just for something for you to look into and see, okay, this is how I like to experiment with my shots. All right, next thing I'll touch on is focusing modes, and pretty much we have two main focusing modes. We have autofocus and manual focus. Now with autofocus, basically what that does is it makes your camera focus for you. With manual focus, you are going to be manual focusing on your camera. Now, what I can definitely say is cameras, especially nowadays, have come so far that honestly speaking, you can rely entirely on autofocus, because I would say 9 out of 10 times your autofocus is going to be extremely accurate, and the person that will more likely make the mistake with focusing will be you. Because for you to get the correct focus on your image, you have to, use that small viewfinder on the back of your camera and ensure that your image is in focus. But with cameras nowadays, once you select the right points and you're in a bright space, then your camera will more than likely get the correct focus. So I definitely say if you have a modern day camera, you're probably better off autofocusing, but you can feel free to manual focus. I don't use manual focus in photos. I'll do it with videos sometimes, but I am 9 out of 10 times using autofocus. All right, so now you know about autofocus, you know about the exposure triangle, you know about RAW, or you have a basic understanding of composition. The next thing I'll tell you is about lighting. Now, lighting is extremely important, and for a beginner photographer, the first thing that I can say to you is shoot outdoors. Indoors can be very tricky because it's going to be hard, especially if you're not used to lighting. So shoot outdoors and get comfortable with the sun. The sun is something that basically you don't have much control over, so you're gonna have to learn to work with the sun. And how you work with the sun is you choose the right time of day to shoot. Now, we have something called golden hour, which is 2 times during the day. It's when the sun rises and when the sun sets. When the sun rises, it's gonna give you the best quality of light because the sun is gonna rise and it's gonna be very soft, warm, refreshing light. As the day goes further, the sun becomes very harsh, and it's going to be not the most pleasant lighting, especially for faces. Now, this is my bias towards portrait photography. To be honest, maybe if you're a landscape photographer, or maybe if you're not necessarily shooting people, that harsh lighting might work for you. Harsh lighting isn't inherently bad, it's just that for faces it's not the best. The thing is, naturally when I talk about good light, or when we think of good lighting, we think about soft, cinematic, or professional looking lighting. And that is going to be looking very controlled, that's going to be looking very flattering on faces, and that's very flattering generally. But you don't only have to shoot at those times, but it depends on what you're trying to convey. So for me, as someone that does a lot of portraits and someone that does a lot of like scenic landscapes, I like the sunrise, I like the sunset, and I like to shoot at those times. Those are the best times for you to shoot. If you can't shoot at those times, find places where the sun isn't necessarily, harsh on persons or harsh on objects. Find places where maybe the sunlight is bouncing off something, so it's a lot softer. Learn to play around with light. Learn to understand quality of light. As I said before, quality of light is harshness, harsh and soft. Learn to understand, size. You have, big light. You have small light. You just learn about lighting as much as you can, because lighting is going to change your pictures, drastically. Learn about positions of lights. So you can have a light behind your head, you can have light in front of your face, you can have light to the side. Learn how this affects your images. Learn how it affects the feeling. Just learn these things, and trust me, it will go a very far way. Personally, if you're a portrait photographer, just shoot at those sunrise, sunset, and slowly start to see like how you can start adding additional lighting stuff. Because for me personally, I can shoot any time of the day because I'm using you know, light modifiers, and I'm using strobes. So what a strobe is basically is a strobe is just a color flash. So a flash is just basically like a mini light that just flashes for a second. And with those lights, I'm using very big, what you call light modifiers. And that basically allows me for a small second to overpower the sun and position my lights in a particular way. Now, as a beginner, you do not need to learn flash photography at first. In fact, it's very complicated. I would do an entire video on flash photography if you guys want that. But flash photography is something that I hated for a very long time. And I just basically, well, not just, I've been doing this for a while, but like you know, maybe the past, I don't even know anymore, maybe the past like 5 years. But in the beginning of my journey, I was not big on flash photography. I hated flash photography. I would say I only like to shoot natural light. And that was because I didn't know about flash photography. So as somebody that knows it now, I definitely love it and I think it's amazing. And I think it gives you control, which is why I love studio shoots, because it gives you like that ultimate control. But as a beginner, you should learn from the sun, learn to work around the sun, and then you can work your way up to flash photography. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, watch this video right here.